Good afternoon. I'm Robert Kibrick, Legislative Analyst with the Verified Voting Foundation. I'll be talking about resources needed for post-election audits. My co-authors are Gail Pellerin, County Clerk of Santa Cruz County, California, and Jamie Young, the Santa Cruz County Elections Department. Next slide. I'll be talking about key factors affecting costs of election audits, California's 1% manual audit requirement. We'll look at audit data from Santa Cruz County, California. We'll investigate why VVPAT rolls are difficult to audit and audit costs are difficult to predict. And we'll look at research needed to better predict audit costs. Next slide. Key factors affecting audit costs are the scope of the audit, the type of the voting system or systems employed, the method of manual counting used during the audit, the size and composition of the manual audit, and 1% of the county's precincts selected at random. Additional precincts are selected to ensure that all contests in the county are audited. Other precincts can be selected at the discretion of elections officials. Initially, this requirement applied only to ballots cast in polling places, and when paperless DREs were deployed in the early 2000s, its application was ill-defined. Starting in 2004, however, all DREs in California were required to have voter-verified paper audit trails, or VVPATs. And in 2006, clarifying legislation established that the VVPAT must be the record that is audited. In 2008, the 1% audit will be expanded to include absentee ballots. Next slide. We'll be looking at audit data from the November 2006 general election in Santa Cruz County, California. It has a population of about 250,000 and 142,000 registered voters. In that election, about 92,000 ballots were cast, representing a turnout of 65%. Of those, roughly 55% were cast in the polling place and 45% via absentee ballot. Most ballots cast in Santa Cruz County are optical scan paper ballots. Those cast in the polling place are counted on Sequoia precinct count optical scanners, while those cast via absentee are centrally counted on high-speed scanners at the County Elections Department. For accessibility, at least one Sequoia ABC Edge touchscreen voting machine is deployed per polling place. Next slide. In that general election, there were a total of 45 contests on the ballot, and there were 317 voting precincts. Voters in 170 precincts voted in person at one of 117 polling places throughout the county. Most of those polling places had only one precinct assigned, but some had as many as 5 precincts. In addition, there were 147 other precincts containing less than 250 voters. There were no polling places assigned to those precincts, and the voters in those 140 precincts were required to vote by mail. 4 voting precincts were selected for the 1% manual audit sample that covered all contests on the ballot. 19 additional precincts were selected to capture contests not covered by the initial 1% sample. The precincts were selected at random by drawing film canisters out of a bowl, each canister containing a number of one of the 317 precincts. The selection process took about 1 hour. Next slide. The 1% manual audits took place at the County Elections Department. During that process, if any discrepancies were found, they were investigated and resolved. Different numbers of staff worked on different days of the audit, and a staff of up to 15 worked over a period of 5 days. Up to 14 counters were involved, each paid $15 an hour, and 1 or 2 supervisors were involved on any given day and were paid between $25 to $33 an hour. Different counting methods were used for optical scan paper ballots and for the VVPATs produced by DRE voting machines. The audits of those VVPATs proved to be much more labor intensive. Next slide. The 1% manual audit of the optical scan paper ballots involved an initial first pass to count the total number of ballots from that precinct. That count was compared to the count on the post-election ballot accounting form, a copy of which should be in your printed materials. That form is completed by poll workers when the polls close. It accounts for all of the ballots in the precinct, voted ballots, spoiled ballots, unused ballots. And it also reconciles the number of ballots cast to the voters signing the poll book. This is an essential first step of the audit that occurs on election night and ensures that when the manual count is done, the proper number of ballots are being counted. A separate pass is made through the ballots for each of the contests to be audited. Manual tally of those ballots compared the hand counts to the tallies printed on the summary tapes printed by the precinct count optical scanner. The hand counts were also compared to the initial central tabulation for that precinct. 2 4-person audit boards and 1 floating supervisor were involved in this audit. Next slide. The 1% manual audit of the VVPAT printouts from the DRE voting machines began by comparing the number of VVPATs on the roll to the number of VVPATs recorded on the post-election ballot accounting form for that precinct. The main difference in processing the VVPATs compared to the optical scan ballots was that all of the contests to be audited were counted in a single pass through the VVPAT roll. The manual tally of the contests compared the hand tally to the results printed by the summary tape on election night by the DRE voting machine that produced that VVPAT. The hand tallies were also compared to the initial central tabulation for that precinct. 1 2-person audit board and a floating supervisor were involved in this 1% manual audit of the VVPAT printouts. The VVPATs are printed on a continuous roll of paper, and 2 paint rollers mounted on wooden stands were used to wind through the VVPAT tape. Next slide. This photo shows the paint roller apparatus that was used for this purpose. As you can see, the spacing between the 2 rollers can be adjusted to match the length of the VVPAT that is printed. Next slide. In addition to the 1% manual audit, Santa Cruz County conducts a 10% manual audit of DRE voting machines. This requirement was adopted by our Board of Supervisors in January of 2006, and the first such audit conducted in November 2006. 123 DRE voting machines were deployed to 117 polling places during that election. Of those, 13 units were selected for audit, representing 10% of the DREs. Due to complications involving DREs that were shared between precincts in multi-precinct polling places, in fact, a total of 14 DREs representing 18 precincts were selected for audit. The audit also included early votes cast by voters from any of those precincts selected for audit. A similar scheme drawing film canisters from a poll was used to select these precincts. A total of 573 VVPATs were audited during this process. That averaged 32 such VVPATs per precinct, or 41 per DRE voting machine audited. Next slide. The effort for the 10% audit required a staff of 8 counters plus a floating supervisor working for a period of 3 days. During this process, 1 manual VVPAT printout was discovered from a jammed VVPAT printer. 2 VVPATs were discovered countywide that had no selections recorded whatsoever, 1 found during the audit and 1 during a subsequent recount. Next slide. VVPATs printed on a continuous roll of paper are more difficult to hand tally than individual optical scan paper ballots. It takes time to wind from one VVPAT to the next on the roll, and that winding time penalty motivates counting all of the contests in a single pass through the VVPAT roll. In addition, in multi-precinct polling places, the VVPATs for multiple precincts will be printed on the same VVPAT roll. If one is then auditing only the VVPATs from a selected precinct, one has to separate those out from the other ones that are printed on the same roll. So in auditing one of these rolls, one has to skip over any VVPATs that have been voided by the voters, any provisional ballots that have been cast on that DRE, since those provisional ballots will not show up in the initial tallies printed on the DRE summary tape, nor in the initial central tabulation for that precinct. And one also has to skip over the VVPATs from other precincts printed on that roll of tape that were not selected for audit. Next slide. In an attempt to overcome some of these difficulties, some jurisdictions have cut VVPAT rolls into separate pieces. This eliminates the winding time penalty and allows one to set aside the voided and provisional VVPATs. However, cutting the VVPAT rolls itself takes time and risks damage to the tape. The thin, lightweight paper pieces are hard to handle, and this can complicate long-term storage. Audits may be easier if precincts don't share the same DRE. If you have a distinct DRE for each precinct, then you don't have a mix of precincts printed on the same DRE VVPAT roll. In addition, using paper ballots rather than DREs for provisional ballots simplifies the audit process, but may make the tabulation of out-of-precinct provisional ballots somewhat harder. Next slide. There are significant difficulties in predicting audit costs from existing audit data. Much of that data is aggregated and quite anecdotal. We're currently lacking fine-grade data for the costs of the individual steps of the audit. The audit costs can also vary significantly with the type of voting system used, whether it's DRE VVPAT or optical scan. And it can even differ significantly between different styles of optical scan ballots, such as the conventional form with a name followed by a bubble versus an Inca-vote ballot, which is an optical scan ballot, but formatted much more like a punch card. In addition, the number of ballots to be audited is uncertain, at least under an audit strategy such as we have in California. There's huge variation in the number of ballots cast per precinct. We had precincts in the November 2006 election with 0 ballots cast and other precincts with as many as 553. Since the precincts selected for audit are determined at random, you can't predict in advance exactly how many ballots will be audited. The cost may not scale linearly as the sample is increased. For example, if you run out of trained staff and need to recruit temporary staff, there'll be training costs. If you run out of space in your elections department and need to rent additional space, there'll be similar quantum steps in the cost. And furthermore, the speed and accuracy of your workers will decline as fatigue sets in. Next slide. Because of the difficulty in predicting audit costs, more research is needed. Legislators writing election audit legislation, elections officials who are developing audit procedures, or jurisdictions who are trying to compare the costs of audits imposed by different types of voting technologies, all need a better ability to predict the costs of post-election audits. Elections officials are best suited to collect that data, but we need to reach a consensus on what are the proper metrics for measuring audit costs. We need to reach a consensus on standard reporting formats so that data from different jurisdictions can be compared. And some other entity needs to be identified to collate and analyze the data on election audit costs from jurisdictions throughout the country. I would like to encourage the EAC, the states,